Hello, my name is Stephen and I'd like to talk about the top 5 mistakes that are made by graduates during interviews. The first thing I'd like to mention is students and graduates who either have to put an interview back, postpone the interview, or turn up late, and the effect that that has on the employer. Unfortunately, the employer hasn't really got to know you as a person yet, so if you do show up late for an interview, it may be that there's a good reason. There may have been a train delay or something similar, but they will assume that there may be an issue with timekeeping. They might, as I say, not know for sure, but that could be enough if there's 10 applicants to just focus on the applicants that could make it in on time. And I think the same applies if a candidate asks to reschedule an interview and move it back a day or two. Again, if that's due to sickness or something, it may be something that can't be avoided. But I always think, as an employer, they want to see somebody turn up, even if they apologise and say they're slightly under the weather. If they're still able to make the appointment on time, it shows the sort of commitment and dedication that is needed in the workplace and that employers do value. The second common mistake that happens in a graduate interview is students forgetting their grades and their academic qualifications, which doesn't sound believable and isn't really. I think as an employer, if you're asking a student what grades they got at their A-levels or something similar, we would expect as an employer the student to know those grades. And if somebody is wanting to cover for those grades, maybe hasn't got the grades that they were hoping for, they may look to kind of mumble out an answer and be a little bit vague, and that will normally mean that the employer goes back, asks it a second time, and really comes away with the impression that the candidate is quite evasive, and a polite way of putting it is lying if they say they don't know what the grades are. I think it's much better in an interview to be open, to say what the grades are, to maybe justify them or say you're disappointed with them if they're not as good as you hoped for, but to at least project yourself as honest, because those type of statistics will get found out. The third common mistake that graduates make when they're interviewed is to talk about needing time to relax after a period of study and a summer holiday, or sometimes after completing their degree course. And we can completely understand that, and I think the employer does know that the summers are there to be enjoyed, but I think the phrasing of that is important. And if a student or graduate is able to say in the interview that they maybe had a few months where they enjoyed travelling and they went to a destination that was new to them, or they spent time with friends or family, that sounds good and it gives a positive impression in the interview. But if they phrase it differently and said that they needed to relax because they'd worked so hard for 8 or 9 months, it doesn't come across as well, because frankly the employer that's conducting the interview has probably also worked hard for 8 or 9 months, and they're not able to relax for 3 months. So I think the idea of having worked hard and then needing time to relax should be dispelled, but you can still phrase it differently and talk about some positive experiences that you maybe had during those holidays. A fourth mistake that is made by graduates is often that they are a little bit too honest in terms of their future plans. And examples of that include times where students and graduates have sat in interviews, they've been asked what's important to them, and they've maybe said that at some point in the future they'd like to do a master's and relate that to an interest, or relate that to something that isn't required for the job that they're going to. They may also say that they've got plans to possibly travel at some point in the future. All of those answers will immediately put off an employer, and it may be something that the student or graduate doesn't immediately intend to do, but an employer will always pick somebody who says they're now committed to a long-term career. That the employer will want to train that person up over somebody who is still stumbling a little bit, quite uncertain of their options, because frankly the employer will feel that there's a better chance of that candidate leaving if they've got other interests that they're looking to pursue outside of the workplace. So that's something to be concerned about. The fifth mistake that I'd like to highlight is when students and graduates don't have questions prepared for the end of an interview. It's very common that the interview will be conducted, it'll draw towards a conclusion, and the employer will then ask if the person of the subject has got any questions that they'd like to ask. And in some ways that's a way for the student or graduate to have their questions answered, but it's also a way to kind of show what's important to the student and graduate. And so if a student and graduate says no, they've got no questions, or the only question that they have relates to exactly what the hours are or something similar, then it doesn't give as good an impression as if there's a student that's maybe thought through and is able to ask about career progression, is able to ask maybe about examples of other graduates that have joined the firm and how their careers have evolved, maybe able to look at different areas of the business that they might be able to progress in the future. And that will give the impression to the employer that the student is there and is looking long term and is making the decisions on good reasoning, rather than just purely looking for a job and set hours and to leave. So that's something that is good because you can prepare for, but that's another bit of advice to make sure you avoid some of the more common mistakes in the interview.